How's everybody doing this afternoon? Hope everybody's having a good conference so far. So go through a couple of the upfront slides. If you didn't hear it this morning, we're definitely looking for your guys' feedback, right? So feel free to give us your feedback through Gartner Peer Insights. So for this session, introduce myself. My name is Wayne Watson. I head up customer success at Interset. We are a recent acquisition into Micro Focus. We're very excited to be here and looking forward to the next steps for what we're looking at. So the topic for today is user entity behavioral analytics and how that really applies to MITRE ATT&CK framework. So my team at Interset, what we are focused on outside of the kind of traditional customer success is really working with our customers, understanding how to apply behavioral analytics into their environments, and very much looking at how to improve the way that security operations is able to deal with threats. That's both from internal or insider threats, right? Like traditional UEBA is applied to, as well as looking at advanced persistent threats and how they translate into insider threats or inside threats based on once they get into penetration mode. So with that being said, we'll start with a question. How many of you guys are familiar with MITRE ATT&CK framework? So are you guys using it in practice in your organizations, or is it something that you're just coming up to speed with? Okay. So what we're definitely seeing, definitions that we have with a lot of customers is that MITRE is gaining traction, and more people are starting to look at how it can be utilized in their environments. So this and talk about MITRE, what it is, where it originated from, and then also how behavioral analytics apply. Okay. Standard confidential disclaimer. Okay. So for those of you who are not familiar, MITRE itself is a not-for-profit organization. They are not specifically cybersecurity focused. They run a number of federally funded R&D sites, and really their mission is dedicating to making the world safer, right? So what they focus on is finding research projects, funding projects that look at overall problems within the world and how to address them and find them, right? So why we want to bring that up and why it's important is that MITRE did not start the attack framework specifically because they were cybersecurity focused or anything else. They saw it as a growing problem. They started up a research project known as FMX that was targeted to understand what issues were out there, how are companies trying to address them, how can we better solve for them, right? And taking a fresh approach to how to deal with that. So really looking at it, very similar to how Interset was founded, right? Interset is fundamentally an analytics company that looked at how analytics can be applied to cybersecurity and address it in new ways that hadn't really been looked at before. So what ATT&CK stands for, adversarial techniques, or tactics, techniques, and common knowledge, right? So fundamentally what happened, and when they started this FMX research project, they needed a way to understand how they were going to approach it. So the project itself was built around creating scenarios and emulating red team attacks effectively, and then being able to identify how they could find and stop those attacks, right? So what they came up with internally as part of this was this framework that allowed them to identify real world scenarios that could be used in attacks, document them, and then create red team scenarios that would be used, and then being able to measure themselves against it, right? How well were they able to satisfy or address those results, right? Fundamentally, it was so successful within this research project, they decided to release it to the public in 2015. So now it has become, and originally when it started, it was largely just focused on Windows-based security, right? So looking specifically at Windows. Now it's been expanded to look at Mac OS and Linux-based threats as well. and it continues to expand and grow, right? And now it's got a large base of people that are continuing to contribute to it and build it out. One key thing as well is that it was specifically built around endpoint telemetry, right? So they were not looking at how to take in multiple data sources within an environment and spread that across. They were specifically focused on how can endpoint telemetry be used to identify these attacks, okay? This diagram that you see here, we'll talk about a little bit more in some other formats, but basically breaks down the scope of everything that they've tracked and built on top of this knowledge base. So there's several different ways that they represent it throughout it. So what are the principles of attack, right? What are they really trying to achieve with it? So first and foremost, if we can't understand how adversaries are working, then we can't really build a defense around it, right? If we don't know the methods that they're using and how they're using them, then we can't properly prepare for how to defend against it, right? So having a good understanding of, and effectively the idea is the best defense comes from understanding the offense, right? You have to be able to adjust and adapt as things change in the environment. It only works if you can really truly focus on real world examples, right? Going out and tracking, the what ifs and they could possibly do this or they could possibly do that is great, but it doesn't really help you, because if the adversaries really aren't using it in the real world, then you're preparing for something that isn't happening, right? Everything within the knowledge base, that if you look at it, they actually show you, and there are numerous ones in there that will basically show you, we've never seen this in the real world, right? We've envisioned it, but we actually haven't seen it in practice, right? So they are actually tracking known incidents of these being leveraged and utilized, right? Which is super important for what is it that we should be using and what should we be focusing on. And then more importantly, it does give us a mechanism to measure against, right? If we understand what techniques, what tactics they're using, how can we measure ourselves against that, then we can be far more effective in the approaches that we take. Next core area, analytics is foundational, right? When they started the FMX project, they immediately understood that when they started looking at real world examples, that they weren't going to be able to find this strictly with rules, right? And the reason why is because what is commonly used as the tactics and techniques by adversaries have everyday real world practicality to them as well, right? The common term that you hear is adversaries today want to live off the land. They're going to leverage and utilize the tools that are available to them that are actually legitimate tools within a customer or within an environment. And so just trying to track against them, you're going to end up with alert storms trying to find them, right? Because they have real world practicality in them as well. With that being said, right, the traditional solutions just can't keep up with it, right? They're always behind the 8 ball of trying to build out new rules, new signatures, new definitions, and trying to be able to track against that. Companies just simply can't keep up with it and publish them out there quick enough to stay in front of the threats that are out there. And then finally, the way that attacks happen, they're not point in time. They happen across the course of days, months, whatever it is. So the typical indicators are way too narrow to really effectively find it, right? If you're just tracking based on, I'm expecting even this series of events to happen, and you don't have an understanding of what the time frame might look like or anything else, then you're simply going to miss it, right? The signature is too small to be able to be picked up with simple rule structures or anything else. And then finally, the last area for MITRE is a common taxonomy, right? Being able to break this down into a language that everybody can talk about and communicate with and share across security teams significantly helps in being able to understand what people are up against, right? Being able to talk in common terms, what tactics, what techniques are being used, and being able to put it into that common language. One other piece on that, and we'll talk about it in this next slide. As they started looking at the common kill chain that was known, right, is that what they found is that these concepts here, recon, weaponize, deliver, exploit, control, execute, and maintain, they were far too high level and not specific enough to really be effective in a defensive strategy, right? So the key thing though with attack is that these pre-compromise are not in scope, right? What they did is they took these last three in the kill chain, control, execute, and maintain, and they broke them down into these specific tactics here. And it's all built on post-compromise, right? So that the goal here is, if you've been compromised, how do you find it? How do you stop it? And how do you make it that control, right? Attack is not focused on the pre-compromise behaviors. It's focused entirely on post-compromise. So from there, with our 11 tactics, which represent this top bar across here, what you end up with and what the tactics represent is, why does the adversary want to do this, right? What is it that they're trying to achieve, right? So is it initial access? Is it execution, persistence, defense evasion? And it can be multiple of them all at the same time. But effectively, the tactic describes why. What is their objective for trying to do this, right? The techniques then that fall under each category of the tactics represent the how, or what is it that they're trying to actually get, right? The end goal, command and control and exfiltration at the very end, right? Every adversary in your environment, ultimately at the end of the day, is trying to get to this last stage. Everything else is building up, right? Collection, lateral movement, discovery, they're building up to that point of being able to either exfiltrate data or keep a command and control presence within that environment. What's that? Yeah, they'll be available. This is also all out on the MITRE.org website. So everything out here is publicly available. There's nothing that is restricted about that. Absolutely. Yeah, and it's definitely an eye chart, right? Altogether, if you add this up, right, there is over, I think, there's over 250 specific techniques that they're tracking in MITRE, right? So it's a big database. And again, you break down each one of these techniques, they go down a layer further, which goes into what they call procedures, which actually breaks down each one of these techniques into potentially multiple procedures, and they track against how many times has it been seen out in the field, in the wild, all that kind of stuff. It's a rich database of information. So with this though, right, we can now start to understand what adversaries are using, how they're moving through our environment, and how to track them, right? But obviously, as we can see, there's a lot of options that they have in front of them. So with that, right, we have this big, huge wealth of information. How is MITRE ATT&CK being used today, right? How are people leveraging it? So I think obviously we've already talked about the key thing that why they pushed it out to be public is to represent a knowledge base, right? To give people a place to go seek information and understand what's going on. But more so than that, one of the key things that MITRE.org themselves has been doing is actually taking this and profiling adversary groups, right? So recently they just published APT 29. You can see here, and it's again very small. They basically break down and they go through different APT threats, and they break down which tactics and which techniques they commonly see in the way that they're approaching it, right? This is everything from nation state actors, everybody. They start breaking them down so that you can start looking at a profile of how they operate and try to sort it out. Additionally, one of the other areas that MITRE has started to become very active in is evaluating and measuring coverage of all these tactics and techniques across different vendors, right? And specifically, we're talking about endpoint vendors here, right? So CrowdStrike, Carbon Black, all of these guys are starting to measure themselves against the coverage that they provide within the MITRE ATT&CK framework. The last two become the big ones when it comes to companies and how companies need to be looking at using a MITRE, right? Which is using the knowledge base to build out immolation scenarios for red teams or internal pen testing or any other piece of it, so that they can create their own structured attacks, and then being able to take that and measure how effective they are against finding it, right? So almost every red team attack now is in some way built off of top of MITRE ATT&CK framework and using it. But if you're not then taking that in looking at how you're going to measure the effectiveness of it, in which areas do you have gaps, where are you seeing holes, then it's really not going to help solve the problem, right? The red team attack may get through, but if you're not really addressing how effective were you, and then planning out how you're going to address that moving forward, then ultimately at the end of the day, that red team attack did not deliver the value it needed to deliver. Before we go forward, any questions on MITRE or any of these pieces? So with that, how does behavioral analytics then apply to MITRE, right? Well, the bottom line is, and if you've sat in, I've seen several of you here have sat in on Stefan's earlier sessions on Data Science 101. I'm sure you saw the keynote today, right? Is behavioral analytics ultimately becomes key in being successful with MITRE ATT&CK framework. One, as we already talked about, the tactics and techniques that are being used, they have real world practicality in them, right? If we don't look at how behavior is and how that is different or normal and abnormal behavioral usage in your environment, then what you're going to end up with is an alert storm, right? You're going to have to write rules or super complex correlation that tries to look at and combine all these behaviors and patterns that simply is not going to be effective in your environment, right? So first, the key piece comes to, we have to acquire data, right? Now, if you have endpoint solutions like CrowdStrike or Carbon Black or any of that kind of stuff, but additionally, we can look at other data sources as well to help enrich that, right? We can look at Active Directory data. We can look at DLP data, other access management data, even data from business apps, right? SQL queries, everything else from looking at databases to help enrich that data, right? While MITRE was originally built around the idea of endpoint data and endpoint telemetry, it's not specific to just that, right? There's certainly wealth in all of these other data sources. But also additionally, when we acquire that data, how we structure that data is ultimately critical, right? If we're not focused on the way that we group it and bring it together, then it's not going to make a big difference, right? So just focusing on raw events is not going to help us, right? So the way that we deal with it is that we group that data together into entities, and then we also group by time windows and everything else so that we can analyze it, right? So by driving data into entities, understanding which users are performing which ways and which actions they're taking within the environment, and taking all those events together and creating entities out of them, whether those be user entities, machine entities, file repository entities, any of those kinds of things, we can now start to understand what is the normal behavior, right, of each one of those entities. And then we can then also detect where is the abnormal, right? Understanding specifically from a unique normal behavior, right, for every individual user or every individual entity in the system, and then start to being able to detect where is that anomalous, that's what gives us our threat leads, right? Now, instead of dealing with a huge number or a huge volume of alerts, we now are focused in on these specific entities are acting different than what they would normally act. Key thing here, though, is that is abnormal bad or good? We don't know, right? It can be both. You can have a user that forgot to submit their expense report, and so they log in at 3 a.m. just so they can submit their expense report. Guess what? That's abnormal behavior. They don't normally log in at 3 a.m., but there was a driving factor. There was context that drove that behavior, right? So the key thing about behavioral analytics is that it doesn't really detect good or bad. It detects the difference between normal behavior and abnormal behavior. So there's additional pieces that go into it. But these threat leads, now this is what goes to our analysts. This is what goes into our correlation engines. These threat leads and the anomalous events that they drive can be used to help enrich the rest of that story. So the way that we work with it, right, is that we take in that data like we talked about. Here on the far my left, you take in that data. From there, we extract the features, right? The behaviors that are going on. So Ann moves a significant volume of data and access and takes files from file folders, right? So we start to extract those features and start looking at that and then start detecting the anomalous behavior, right? And as Stefan said, it's not about just using one algorithm or one model. It's about understanding what the use cases are and applying the right use case for what you're looking for, right? It could be rare access. It can be unusual amount of volume. It can be time of day, all of those pieces, and being able to extract out all of those anomalous behaviors. And then it's about taking all of those together, mapping them against those entities, and then determining a risk for each one of them, right? But as we said, right, we simply can't just rely on that anomaly detection by itself, right? What we need is we need additional context. We need our rules and thresholds. We need pattern matching for very specific things that will start to highlight. It's this combined behavior, right, where we leverage all of the pieces all together that ultimately helps us identify those threats and stop them, right? Without taking all of them into account and really understand what's going on. And by the way, this happens, it's not automated, right? This takes iteration. It takes constantly going back and reviewing. This is why we need to measure how effective we're being, right? And then constantly be able to update and improve it, right? Do we have the right anomaly detection in place? Are we driving that with the right kind of context with rules and thresholds so that we're submitting and getting true automated or true realistic threat leads that we want to investigate against? So this chart here, right, basically takes the same MITRE ATT&CK framework, and what it's overlaying with it, where you see all the green boxes, is by applying behavioral analytics, this is basically what we're able to, all of the different techniques that we're able to detect with just using the behavioral analytics. This is specific to us at Interset, right? And what we have with the 450 plus models that we apply, we're able to cover about 75% of the techniques that are used. So let's look at a real world example, right? And this is actually based on a red team attack that we worked with the customer to detect and uncover, right? So data across 36-day period, over 970 million events processed, right? Which is obviously a ton of data, almost 1 billion records to go through. Of that, we had 25,000 entities defined. Actually a little bit more than that, but roughly about 25,000 entities. Once we ran our analytics on it, that came down to about under 50 threat leads that we wanted to investigate. Yes. Yes, in this case it was endpoints. But so the 25,000 represents users, the actual machines themselves, all of that combined, right? So the entities is actually a grouping of the actual machines where the endpoints were running, and then also the users that were associated to those machines. I think all together for this one, I think it was, Paul, do you remember, is it about 3,000, 2,000, 3,000 endpoints that were deployed? Okay. Yeah, so roughly 3,000 endpoints that then manifested into 25,000 entities. So with this and with the analytics that we ran, we were able to uncover credential access, execution, privilege escalation, defense evasion, lateral movement, and data exfiltration, right? So out of those 11, the 11 tactics, right, we covered more than half of them just in that 36-day range. So where it started, and if we look at this diagram on the top, you can see that all of these boxes represent groupings of anomalous behavior. The purple and blue line actually represent two of the key users, user accounts that were engaged in the attack. And you can see here that we see the spike up, the growing risk score with a spike around March 9th or so, March 8th, in that data. So a couple things here, right? So what we noticed originally is that, and we did not catch the initial access, right? So we do not know how they initially compromised the account for user one, but they were able to get on there. They actually ran PowerShell, which was unusual for that user. From there, they were actually able to get to this script, a PowerShell script that was actually left over by an IT provider that had been setting up the environment for them and had left it. So the red team, again, talking about being able to leverage just things that are out in the wild, living off the land, actually identified this script that would dump a local admin out to a CSV file. They executed it, and now they actually had access to be able to do lateral movement. Right? So here, just in this first piece, right, you've actually got bad IT hygiene, right? Leaving behind scripts that shouldn't be left behind, right? But immediately they were able to compromise an account and then leverage that and start moving around the environment. You'll also notice here, right? So this initially happened on February 24th. The next indicator didn't really pop up until 4 days later on the 28th, right? What we talked about earlier, right? It's not about a sustained series of events, right? People are going to be smart about how they do it, right? They're not worried about trying to get this all done in 6 hours or 5 hours, right? They know that the way to behave is to be slow, methodical, and tactical about how they're doing it, right? So these red teams are looking at, hey, I already got the access account, but if I jump in and immediately go and laterally move to another box, that might be picked up in rules, right? Oh, look, this person logged in here, another, and across an event of 6 hours, you may be able to build those correlation rules to pick it up, right? But across 4 days, the fact that this user logged in, and if you're looking at alerts in a normal SIM console, you're not going to tie this together with this, right? Over a 4-day span. Who knows if you're even talking about the same SOC analyst that's looking at those two events on those given days. On February 28th, we now know that this user actually has an admin access account, right, that they pulled from this script, and is able to move across to workstation 01 using network access. And again, something that they did not normally do, right? So we were able to pick this up as an anomaly because this admin user doesn't usually access this workstation, especially with a login type of 3, right? With the network access login type. So this anomaly points us to the next set of events. So like I mentioned earlier, right? The tactics and techniques that they use are not going to necessarily be siloed as well, right? So what we saw next were a series on 2 of them happening, one in the morning on February 28th again, right? So after he accessed workstation 01, he's basically running some PowerShell. But he was also making sure that nobody else knew what he was running in that PowerShell, right? I think, and Paul, correct me if I'm wrong, I think this was actually double encoded, right? So they actually encoded it and then re-encoded it in the PowerShell command. So again, any user looking at this, that might pop up as like, hey, why is someone running an encoded message? But there's also reasons that you would want to run encoded PowerShell, right? You don't want to see things on the command line that might represent user accounts or anything else that you're looking for. Later in that day, there it is. So again, on that same workstation, right, they run this command script. So they're executing the script. Notice the path, right? So by basically hiding this updater.exe, which is effectively, if you look at the command string, this is basically masqueraded PowerShell, right? They effectively redefined PowerShell as updater.exe inside the Intel directory to make it look like they were just running some Intel updater, right? Again, just trying to hide within plain sight. Then again, several days later, right? 4 days later again, they move on to another server, right? This time using Reg Server 32. Now they're actually loading up this, again, masqueraded firmware library, which now starts to give them access across the environment and lets them move more freely around the environment. All, again, hidden under this kind of Intel update. So now again on March 4th, right? They, again, on a new workstation. So now we've already seen 3 workstations involved in this attack, right? So they've laterally moved between workstation 1, 2, and 3. Again, just hidden for protection. And starting to run this same firmware and running it across multiple servers. Finally, here we see the exfiltration, right? So they basically were able to get on the machine, run this command file through this DNX exfil, and basically start exfilling out Excel files. So, and again, we can see that the course of action, right, is that we started picking this up on February 24th, and it started moving and finally all the way through March 4th when they finished up, right? And there was actually additional activities other than this. So as a plug for this, tomorrow, my colleague in the back, Paul Reed, will actually be doing an even deeper dive on this red team attack and some other ones. So I would highly recommend you go into his session as well. Okay, and I'm probably far earlier than I expected to be. Not too bad.
So,
Sure. Yeah.
So when you say that used a process that has only been used 5 days, you mean that it was only used 5 days ago?
No, it's only been used. So we've only seen on this particular workstation that command.exe is not commonly used, right? So what it's saying is that effectively this is not a common process to be run on this workstation.
And that's in the 36 days that you suggested.
Yes. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. So, and that's a big thing that you'll notice, right? Especially as you look through that MITRE attack framework, right? Being able to track process behavior is fundamentally critical, right? It is with most of the tactics and techniques, especially as you get up into exfil, lateral movement, all that kind of stuff, right? Being able to understand which processes should or should not be running on a machine or should not be executed by users become fundamentally critical to identifying this stuff, right? And it is built around that behavior.
How did you guys figure that out? I mean, Windows has all these process IDs and all this event IDs. What kind of?
So our analytics basically goes through and looks at all of the executions and determines what is normal and what's not normal on that particular box, right? For each, and it tracks by process, right? So it's actually creating a unique normal for this machine and for the process being executed. And is it normal or abnormal for that process to be running on this box? Same with a user executing a process, right? So if we go back to this first one, right? It was the thing that first triggered us was that this user used PowerShell, which they are not commonly using, right? So that actually is where the thread started and said, hey, this is worth using, right? Especially something like PowerShell, right? Which is should a normal user be using it in their environment? If it's not normal for them to use, then we want to understand why they're using it, right? Because the potential to do damage with PowerShell is huge, right?
So does PowerShell become an entity then?
Right now, we do not track processes as entities, although it is something that we are actively exploring, right? Like, especially now as we understand more and more about MITRE, like understanding the tactics and techniques from our work with MITRE so far, it is something that we've been talking about, right? Where process perhaps should be considered its own entity type. Yeah, so right now we're tracking users and machines and like file shares and all those kinds of stuff. Processes actually should also be probably considered an entity. And for us personally, as at Interset, right, like that's one of the key ways that we're looking at MITRE and how to use it, right? Understanding the tactics and techniques, measuring ourselves against it, and what ways should we be improving the product, right? So everything from like, hey, process should maybe needs to be its own entity so that we can actually track the relationships to it and understand it. Yep, absolutely, very good question. Are there any other questions I can answer for anybody? Okay. Well, thank you very much for your time. If you want to ask any questions after the session, please feel free and have a great day. Like I said, actually a couple of plugs. And I don't know if they're even on here. So there's a couple more sessions today, right? Machine learning and cybersecurity, human machine teaming, both excellent sessions that I would recommend. Also, there are 2 sessions tomorrow that Paul Reed, my colleague, will be delivering. One is talking about the red team attack that we covered in summary today. Another one is kind of some other success stories that we've had with Interset. So highly recommend both of those sessions as well.